Mark Levin leaned forward, his voice sharp, his tone insistent, trying to dominate the exchange with the sheer force of interruption. He had built a career on talking over opponents, cutting them off, never letting their words breathe. But this time, the woman across from him wasn't rattled. Jasmine Crockett sat calm, her eyes steady, her posture collected, and every time his words collided with hers, she let him expend energy like a storm that eventually tires itself out. The audience watching could sense the imbalance. His interruptions grew more frequent, his tone more desperate, and yet she remained unshaken, as if she had anticipated this very moment long before stepping into the room. Levin repeated his interruptions, with a kind of rehearsed impatience, circling back to the same talking points, raising his voice as though volume could substitute for clarity. Crockett, however, knew the power of silence, of measured timing, of letting a man talk himself into a corner. Each time he cut her off, she let him finish, her restraint acting as a mirror that revealed his loss of composure. It was a battle, less about policy and more about control, and everyone watching knew it. The moment began to shift when she finally attempted to answer fully. Her words were smooth, deliberate, meant to be heard. Yet Levin barreled through again, his interruptions swelling like waves on rock. He didn't notice the shift in the room, the way the energy no longer bent toward him, the way the interruptions sounded less like strength and more like weakness. Crockett did, and she waited, because waiting was her weapon. For minutes that stretched longer than they seemed, the pattern repeated. Levin insisting, Crockett trying, Levin overriding, Crockett conceding space only to regain composure. She wasn't trying to outshout him, she was building to something else. The interruptions were not distractions to her, they were evidence, each one stacked like bricks until they formed a wall he couldn't climb down from. The turning point came not with volume, but with timing. Levin launched into another interruption, slicing through her opening words, leaning hard on rhetoric as if the world would collapse if she completed her thought. But instead of raising her voice, Crockett paused. She let his words hang in the air. She waited, and when he finally stopped, perhaps expecting her to stammer or stumble, she leaned forward, her voice firm but controlled, and delivered a single sentence that made the entire room stop breathing. That one line didn't need volume, it carried weight. It was the kind of sentence that didn't just respond to the interruption but exposed it, undercut it, rendered it powerless. Levin blinked, momentarily stunned as if he hadn't prepared for the possibility of losing not by being out-argued, but by being out-centered. He tried to recover, fumbling with another attempt to talk over her, but the power had already shifted. The audience wasn't leaning toward him anymore. They were leaning toward her. The silence after her sentence lasted longer than any of his interruptions. It was the silence of realization, of a dynamic flipped upside down. For the first time, in the exchange, Levin seemed smaller. Crockett didn't raise her voice, didn't fire back with equal aggression. She didn't have to. By staying calm, she revealed what his interruptions truly were. A mask, a performance, a tool meant to rattle someone less prepared. But she wasn't rattled. She had chosen the battlefield carefully, and she won with a single strike. Levin tried, again, because men like him always try again. But every interruption now sounded hollow. Every forceful word echoed against the memory of the sentence she had just dropped. The audience was no longer hearing him. They were replaying her words. Crockett didn't need to say more. She sat back, letting him talk, letting him scramble, letting him reveal himself. By the time the exchange ended, the memory of the interruption had faded, but the sentence remained, ringing in the minds of those who had watched. It wasn't just what she said, it was the timing, the composure, the refusal to be pulled into his rhythm. He had interrupted to take power, but she had turned it into his undoing. That one moment traveled far beyond the room. Clips circulated, rewound, dissected, shared. People repeated her sentence not because it was loud, but because it was precise, a scalpel to his sledgehammer. Commentators analyzed it, supporters celebrated it, and even critics admitted its effectiveness. It wasn't just a political win, it was a lesson in control, in the art of saying less but meaning more. Levin, who had long thrived on force, faced something force couldn't overcome: composure. And Crockett, who understood the weight of words, proved that sometimes the strongest statement isn't a speech or a tirade, but a single sentence, delivered at exactly the right moment. That night, as viewers replayed the clip, many noted the difference in demeanor. One man interrupting endlessly, one woman answering calmly, and then the sudden quiet reversal. It wasn't the volume that won, it was the precision. It wasn't the interruptions that held power, it was the silence that followed her words. In the end, Levin's interruptions faded into background noise, but Crockett's sentence became the headline. A single line that captured the imbalance, ended the chaos, and reminded everyone watching that true strength isn't measured in who shouts the loudest, but in who speaks with the most control. And in that moment, with one sentence, she ended it all. The studio lights burned down with that artificial intensity that makes every gesture feel more deliberate, every glance more revealing. Mark Levin was in his usual posture, leaning forward, voice sharp, words firing rapid and relentless. He didn't wait for silence. He didn't allow space. He talked to conquer. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett sat almost unnervingly calm. She had been in these kinds of rooms before. She had studied the rhythm of men who confused interruption for authority, and she knew the temptation to fight them on their own terms was exactly what gave them fuel. Levin's first interruption came before she had even finished her opening sentence. She began with, "What the American people need to understand," and he swooped in, cutting her off with a booming, "No, no, no, that's not what's happening. That's the problem with your party." He jabbed a finger in the air as though it sealed his argument, as though punctuation could replace evidence. The host looked momentarily uneasy, glancing at Crockett to see whether she would push back, but she didn't. She simply smiled faintly, waiting, almost inviting him to go on. When he finally paused for air, she started again. "If we're talking about the facts on the ground," and again he cut across, louder this time. "The facts? You wouldn't know a fact if it hit you in the face." He laughed at his own words, expecting the audience to follow. A few chuckles sputtered out, but not enough. The silence after his laughter was heavier than he anticipated. Crockett held her poise, folding her hands on the table as though she were watching a child throw a tantrum. She tried again. "The American people deserve a conversation where both sides can—" Another interruption. "Don't lecture me on the American people. I've been doing this for decades. I know what they deserve." His volume rose, his words spilling over hers so completely that her sentence was lost. The cycle continued. He would leap in, she would pause. He would talk over, she would lower her gaze, then raise it again with the same calm expression. This wasn't passivity, it was patience. Every time he thought he was winning by silencing her, he was actually proving her point without her needing to say it. The audience could see the imbalance, one voice frantic, the other restrained. By the fourth interruption, murmurs started in the crowd, not loud enough to break the flow, but audible. Viewers, at home, shifted in their seats, irritated at the constant collisions of his voice with hers. Social media watchers clipped it in real time, counting the interruptions like tally marks on a chalkboard. Levin, oblivious, only grew more animated. He slammed the table once. "This is exactly what's wrong with your generation of politicians. You don't listen. You just recite slogans." Ironically, he hadn't let her finish a single slogan, let alone a full argument. His face reddened, his voice rasped, but he pressed on, addicted to the sound of himself filling space. Crockett adjusted. In her chair, she leaned forward slightly as though about to launch into her full rebuttal. She got 3 words in before he jumped again. "Wrong, wrong, completely wrong." He gestured wide with his hands, talking so fast his sentences collapsed into each other. And that's when it happened. She stopped trying to speak. She let the silence stretch while he thundered over himself. She looked at him, unwavering, the way a mountain looks at a storm, still, immovable, patient, She didn't blink as his words tumbled out. She waited until he finally ran out of steam, ending in a huff, his chest heaving with the exertion of dominance. Then she leaned in, her voice steady, not loud but weighted with precision, and said, "Mark, if you'd ever stop talking long enough to listen, you might actually learn something." The room went still. It wasn't shouted. It wasn't dressed in rhetoric. It was a scalpel cutting clean through the bluster. The sentence didn't need explanation, because it revealed the entire dynamic in a single breath. His interruptions weren't strength. They were insecurity. His endless monologue wasn't persuasion. It was avoidance. The silence after she spoke was louder than anything he had said all night. The audience's murmurs swelled into applause, scattered at first, then rolling. The host's eyebrows shot up. Levin froze, caught between trying to recover and realizing that no recovery would erase that moment. He stammered, "Well, that's not..." But the rhythm was gone. His control had shattered. Every word he tried to form now seemed smaller, less commanding. The audience no longer leaned toward him. They leaned toward her. And she didn't say another word. She didn't need to. That one line replayed across social media within minutes. Clips titled "Crockett silences Levin with one sentence" spread like wildfire. People counted his interruptions in the comments, juxtaposing them with her calm. Supporters wrote, "This is how you handle a bully." Critics begrudgingly admitted, she kept her composure better than anyone else would have. The beauty of the moment wasn't just in what she said, but in how she waited to say it. She didn't meet fire with fire. She let fire burn itself out and then doused the ashes with a single drop of water. The interruption that was supposed to silence her became the very evidence that made her sentence land. Levin, of course, tried to regain ground later. He went on another network claiming he wasn't shut down, insisting he was only passionate, but the clip betrayed him. Viewers saw the reality: a man losing control and a woman reclaiming it with nothing but timing, restraint, and a single, undeniable truth. In that one exchange, Crockett demonstrated something rarely seen in televised debates. Power doesn't always come from the loudest voice. Sometimes it comes from waiting, holding still, and choosing exactly the right moment to speak. Her sentence wasn't just a retort. It was a lesson. A reminder that in the age of constant noise, silence wielded correctly can be devastating. As the headlines multiplied and the clip made its rounds. One thing was certain: people wouldn't remember the dozens of words Levin had shouted. They would remember the single sentence that ended it. Levin's jaw tightened, and for a flicker of a moment his eyes betrayed something he had spent years avoiding: uncertainty. He wasn't used to silence working against him. His entire career had been built on filling every inch of air with words on overwhelming opponents until they faltered. But Crockett hadn't faltered. She hadn't raised her voice or begged for space. She had waited, let him punch himself out, then slipped in with a sentence so precise it felt like it had been waiting all along. He shuffled his papers, a stalling tactic more than anything. "Well, let's get back to the facts," he tried. But the audience wasn't with him anymore. A few claps for Crockett's line still lingered like echoes, and he couldn't drown them out no matter how hard he pressed his tone. Crockett tilted her head slightly, as if inviting him to keep talking, the faintest smile tugging at her lips. That smile wasn't arrogance, it was control. She knew the ground had shifted. Now every interruption he attempted would only reinforce her point. He spoke again, more forceful this time. "The real problem here is that you refuse to acknowledge the failures of your party." And there it was. Another interruption, another cut across her voice. But now the dynamic was reversed. Where before his interruptions looked like dominance, now they looked like desperation. The audience shifted uncomfortably, some even sighing audibly. Crockett didn't even attempt to answer right away. She let him burn through his sentence, nodded once, and when he finally paused, she leaned forward with that same calm steadiness. "Mark, the difference between us is simple. I let you finish your thoughts. You won't let me finish mine. That Tells people everything they need to know. Gasps slipped through the crowd. A few claps followed, sharper this time, more confident. Levin's face flushed deeper. He opened his mouth quickly, trying to smother the moment before it grew. That's not true. That's ridiculous. I've let you speak plenty. But the evidence was stacked against him. Anyone who had been watching knew it wasn't true. Crockett didn't argue the denial. She didn't need to. She simply sat back in her chair, folded her hands, and kept her eyes on him. That silence was worse for him than any shouting match could have been. It forced him to fill it, and the more he filled it, the smaller he appeared. The why host, sensing the imbalance, attempted to restore order. Let's allow Representative Crockett to respond without interruption. It was a rare correction, directed not at her, but at him. Levin bristled. He tried to laugh it off, muttering something about mainstream bias, but the laughter fell flat. Finally, Crockett took her turn. And this time Levin stayed quiet, not because he wanted to, but because the room was against him. She spoke clearly, methodically, laying out her point with the same composure she had held from the start. Every sentence landed more firmly because of the contrast with his earlier chaos. She didn't gloat. She didn't hammer him for the interruptions. She simply let the weight of her measured words draw the spotlight back where it belonged. And when she finished, she added softly but firmly, "That's what happens when we actually let each other speak." The applause that followed wasn't explosive. It was steady, like a tide rolling in. Enough to confirm what everyone had already seen. She had won. Not with volume, not with aggression, but with restraint. Levin shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable. He adjusted his microphone, fiddled with his notes, searched for a way back to the control he had lost. But the more he tried, the more obvious it became that the ground beneath him had shifted permanently. The debate limped on, but the defining moment had already passed. Every viewer knew it. Every clip that circulated online would freeze at the eye. Instant Crockett delivered her one-sentence strike. The rest of the discussion would dissolve into background noise. Later that night, commentators replayed it with relish. Some framed it as a masterclass in patience. Others called it the end of an era for Levin's tactics. Hashtag swirled. She finished it. Leather speak. Crockett vs. Levin. For days the sentence echoed. People quoted it at rallies, in interviews, even in casual conversations. It became shorthand for every moment when someone tries to shout down another and fails. Levin's defenders tried to spin it, but the clip was undeniable. Every interruption he made led straight into the quiet power of her response. What struck people most wasn't the words themselves. It was how she had chosen to deliver them. No anger, no shouting, just patience, precision, and timing. She had let him reveal himself, and then she revealed the truth. And in that revelation, everything shifted. Levin had entered the debate expecting to dominate with force. Instead, he left overshadowed by a single sentence. A sentence that showed the nation, the difference between noise and power, between interruption and authority, between talking and truly being heard. By the end of the week, one truth had crystallized. Mark Levin had interrupted Jasmine Crockett repeatedly, but she ended it all with one sentence. And that sentence would outlive every word he tried to shout over her.